I think in the missions world, you hear a lot of the Jim Elliot stories and the Peace Child, and those are all good. But it takes thousands of just faithful people behind the scenes to make that possible, And I think we should talk about those stories too.
Hey everyone, my name is Shane, and we're excited to have a discussion this afternoon primarily about non-traditional skills in missions, things that maybe you wouldn't think of first off the top of your head if you were to think about what does mission work really look like. And so I'm joined here by a number of people. For me, one of the people happens to be my wife, Tori, so I'm pretty excited about that. And if we could just go around and introduce yourselves briefly, that would be great, and we'll just get right into it. So, Tori?
I am Tori Veldhuizen. I'm married to this good-looking host here.
Oh my.
I was born a missionary kid, and so that's kind of my background, my entry into missions. And then I went to school and studied international community development with a focus more on agriculture. So usually you can find me with either bread dough or dirt in my fingernails. It's what I love. But right now I'm mainly just a stay-at-home mom, farming children. So to two little ones. Yeah. That's me.
Tom Louder, probably the senior at the table. I grew up in Texas. I became a Christian in college. I went on crew staff for a number of years and worked at university campuses, including seminary and graduate school and crew staff. Joined a ministry called Biblical Education by Extension and spent 20 years in East Asia, 10 of which were training so-called underground church leaders. And 10 of which were leading a church for international expats in a major city in the region. And I've been back officially on Pioneer staff for some years here at the Orlando base.
Very cool. Thanks for being here, Tom.
I'm Allison Gregg. I'm kind of like the newbie at the table, but I have been at Pioneers for about a year now, and right now what I'm doing is I'm working as a project manager for Encounter 22, and it's all geared towards people who are interested in missions, whether it be at the very beginning or they're ready to pack their bags and go right away. We just wanted to create that space for them to engage with real-life field workers, so it's been really cool so far.
Awesome.
I am Ann Serdula, and I have been with Pioneers for about 4 years. I was in healthcare for 30-some years. I worked in physical therapy and in orthopedic clinics, and just grew up in the church, have always been very active, did a choir since I was 12. Started a choir, did Sunday school, Bible school, was kind of one of those people, just had 2 children, raised 2 children who also did, my son's an Army chaplain. He served in Afghanistan and Korea, and my daughter was a youth pastor before she had babies. And so that's about it for me.
Awesome. Very good. Well, thanks everyone. I guess my hope would just be that our various backgrounds and experiences, we could just think about what missions could look like. Because I think some people have this idea that to be a missionary maybe means you kind of look like maybe the stereotypical minister or something, where you've got a lot of Bible knowledge, and that's not a bad thing, or maybe a lot of ministry experience, and that's not a bad thing. But sometimes I think missions and being involved in the missions community can look different as well. And so I'm curious, maybe Tom, if I can put you on the spot, I'm curious if in your time on the field, if you worked with other people who maybe brought a unique skill set to your team that was really a little outside of the box.
Well, I'm probably not. Nothing particularly comes to mind. The first 10 years, as I mentioned, I worked in helping train church leaders, so-called underground church leaders. Yeah. And so most of the people that were attracted to the work and were engaged in it had a seminary background and some teaching interest and or educational administrative interest. So it was mostly you were either administrating the effort or we were teaching, networking with those kinds of leaders.
When you say underground, just give me an explanation or kind of a deeper understanding of what you mean by that.
Well, in that context, the government knew of the existence of a vast network of unauthorized churches, but they tolerated the movement so long as they followed certain rules.
Mm-hmm.
What were the rules?
Well, they were, number one, don't grow too large. Number two, don't network, because they didn't want that group to become political and become a political force like in Romania or Poland back in the collapse of those communist governments. Another rule was don't speak against the government. And a fourth rule was don't disturb the neighbors. Because normally these little congregations would meet in an apartment or a small office space.
So were those leaders of those churches, was that their primary job, or were they doing other things in the business world?
Virtually all of them were avocational. There were a few that were supported by the network of churches that they served. But the ones that we worked with, in my experience, was primarily isolated to one part of the country in one major city. Yeah. So I couldn't. The area is huge. There's a vast number of people involved in the movement.
Sure.
So I speak of just one little glimpse of one piece of the pie.
Yeah. Well, and I think but that's great. But it also speaks to just the fact that there's complexity to every situation, that no one situation is alike. I know we spent a little bit of time in Southeast Asia, a little over 2 months, and we saw a lot of opportunity in engaging in like agriculture, for example. It made really interesting inroads with the people there to have discussions about spiritual things. And Tori, I'm just curious, like...
I feel like it's the language of the people, and so wherever you're going, you find what it is that relates to them. And I think there's redeeming aspects of every culture that you go to. So if you can find something, for us it was food, because food is everywhere you go. Yeah. So we thought you can't lose there. That's a practical skill that we can use to serve the people and kind of become like them and live among them.
So what would you say if someone were to say, well, those types of efforts, it's really fundamentally just a means to an end. You're just kind of using agriculture or using your business to...
I don't think it is. I think it's important. Food and agriculture leads us to the people, but I think that there's something about agriculture and food that tells of God. And I think that it's important that we delight in it, that we find joy in whatever it is that we do, whatever it is that we're passionate about, not only because it's the bridge to the people, but because God is the ultimate creator and he's the reason why we're doing whatever it is we're doing.
Yeah.
I think food tells you a lot too about every culture and how they live, and what they eat tells you sometimes their status, or I think it's a universal language in a sense, because if you ever go into a grocery store in different countries and just look at all the different things and the way they eat, it tells you a lot about the people. So I think, and it opens up conversations. I think everyone wants to talk about food. And that,
right.
Yeah.
And because God is the one that is above it all, that is the creator, then that's what inspires us to love, sports, or to love reading, or to love, I think we serve a creative God, and we each reflect him differently. And so you see that on the mission field. Everybody has different gifts to bring. So agriculture is just one of them, but...
Yeah, well, and I think it speaks to something that we all believe here at Pioneers, is just that team and partnership with teammates is so important, where everybody has a different skill that they can contribute. I know, Anne, you've worked at Pioneers for a while now. Currently, you're working in office services. I was talking earlier, Anne will whiz by our office with packages. And I mean, I'm just wondering, like, as you go about even your job on a daily basis, is there an element of how do you see God in even the little details of your daily work?
I think it's all about the mission. I think basically, when it comes down to it, whatever happens during the day really isn't about me. It's about how do you serve and how do you be hands and feet to your coworkers and everybody else that comes through the door. Because part of that is being able to speak to people who come through who may not necessarily be Christians who come through Pioneers. And so what is it that makes us different? And what do they see in us that's going to make it different? So even down to, we have people that work in different areas that aren't necessarily Christian. But we all have an opportunity in our jobs and how we interact with them that makes them see that there's something else there. And what is it? And that we can speak to them. I've had a few of those conversations, with people that had worked in our guardhouse that weren't, who came to know Christ and who was looking at us saying, well, you're a mission organization. And I said, yes. And so I've had it has enabled me to have a lot of good conversations with people who aren't necessarily Pioneers employees, but are here.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what does that look like? How do I represent? For me, that's really the important thing. I want people to see that there's something more than just this lovely building and,
Sure. Yeah, that's really encouraging.
I think what's so cool about your story is that it's the humble, faithful obedience that's kind of behind the scenes. I think in the missions world, you hear a lot of the Jim Elliot stories and the Peace Child, and those are all good. But it takes thousands of just faithful people behind the scenes to make that possible, And so God uses the cogs in the machine, And I think we should talk about those stories too.
Totally.
For me, I feel like it's a privilege to be here. I worked in healthcare taking care of people for a long time, but this is different. So this is my first time in working in a mission organization, but I feel like it's a gift that God has given me. So, how am I best using those gifts? And the gifts of, right now, it's using hospitality, but, what am I doing with those gifts that I learned in healthcare on how to, how to help people, how to read people, how to welcome people. That's the most, so I look at that like I'm being blessed, so I feel blessed.
Yeah.
Totally.
I'm curious, Allison, just, you're working in sort of a pretty technical role where you're actually managing a lot of moving parts. Do you find a level of significance in just that work of even something like project management? It's a totally different type of skill from farming. It's like a lot on a computer, it's a lot of time in front of a screen.
Yeah.
How do you manage that?
Well, it's something that I've always naturally done. And this could also be the Lord's calling for me too, because when it came to being in college and you would have those group projects and how no one would want to be the group leader, somehow I always became the group leader, and I just said, okay, so if I'm the group leader, then I get to delegate who does what, and then I can just kind of sit back, okay, I'll do that. And so that just kept happening over and over again. And then once I got to my senior year of college and had to, decide what I wanted to do for a career, I was really lost because I didn't really know that positions like this, at like 20-something years old, I didn't know that positions like this existed where your sole purpose can be to ensure that everyone knows what's going on, that everyone knows what they need to do. And by doing that, you can accomplish something that's so much bigger than what one individual can do. So,
and what's interesting, personally, I could see the way you described what you do could totally be applied in a field context if God were to ever, call you to be a part of a team overseas or something.
Right.
Because there are a lot of moving parts to teams who are living in a different culture. There's a lot of complexity to that. And I don't know, it's just encouraging that even like that sort of niche passion of managing a complex project, God really can and does use that, and he's using it now. So it's just an encouragement to you that I work with you on this project. It's very useful to have you checking in on these things that I need to get done. So
well, it's also helpful in the sense of when it's a conversational point too, because I have friends who are Christians, I have friends who are not Christians. Either way, your job title, what you do every day, that is something that gets brought up in conversation all the time. So when I'm speaking to friends who might not necessarily be believers, I, by default, have to explain what I do every day. And then I also have to explain the company that I work for. And by explaining the company I work for, I get to explain what we're all about and who unreached people are and what we do to serve those people. So in a way, it's a really nice, because when it comes to evangelism, I've always felt uncomfortable, starting those conversations off or engaging with someone right away, like, hey, do you know the Lord type thing? But I think that the Lord knows that. And so he's given me opportunities to seamlessly discuss things that are so interwoven that the spiritual conversations just come from that dialogue. And so I don't have to do much work per se, but
well, and I know our marketplace ministries team here at Pioneers talks a lot about this idea of work and worship, where really what we do for work is a form of worship unto God. It's integrated with our lives, and really, if we're in America, maybe we're not living in an unreached population. Embracing that idea of work and worship now is important, because if you were to ever be called to move to a different country or to a place where there's no access to the gospel, hopefully it's the same thing, where the work that you were given to do should be integrated with your life. And just to switch gears really quick, I'm curious to hear, Tom, in your experience on the field, I'm assuming there were other team members, and you had kids of your own, and other team members had kids, and I think that's a family is another dynamic about field life that is worth considering, because I think when you move to another culture and it's different from what you're used to, and it's different for your kids too, incorporating them into that is a job. It's I think we need to do it very carefully. How did that work out for you and for maybe some of your teammates or the people there in your community in regards to dealing with children and family on the field?
Yeah, I think raising kids on the mission field varies, of course. Just like life is complicated, the mission field is complicated. People live in very, very different contexts. Somebody that's living in rural outer Mongolia, for example, is going to have a whole different set of challenges than somebody living in a major international city, even if it's abroad. So in our particular case, we were raising our kids in two cities that we lived in that were major international cities with huge populations of foreigners, expat foreigners that lived there. So they were international schools. There, you could function in English in some ways, in some contexts, or a lot of contexts.
Right.
And so there wasn't quite as much cultural distance for us with our kids. So we, one year, we had our kids in a local school in which they were speaking the local language all day, every day. It was extremely high stress. We only chose to do that for a year because in their case they weren't adapting well to that. But we had friends who put kids in there for years who became incredibly fluent, and totally bilingual.
Wow. That's great.
But Yeah, it's a very personal decision about how you want to do it, and we chose because of the ease of transportation, and at that time it was a little less expensive than flights are these days. Instead of coming back every 4 years, we arranged ultimately so that they would come back. My wife and our 2 sons would come back every summer, and sometimes I would follow them, and sometimes I wouldn't.
Right.
But we wanted to keep them well integrated with the state, so they would feel relatively at home in the States and would find the transition back to college a little easier than they might have otherwise. Right. So we've seen a lot of different approaches to child rearing in the field, and it can, a lot of different ways can work. Sure. Depending on the circumstances.
Yeah, and I mean, whether it's on the field or in America, having kids is a massive responsibility. Tori and I have 2; they're very young, and we.
Yeah, I was gonna. Yeah. Sorry.
No, go.
I was gonna say, I feel like being a mother or being a father is a mission field in itself. It's like you have these little disciples, and you have them for 18 years, which is longer. Yeah, that's a long time. So it's a privilege, but. Even within the home, if you think about where it all begins, where the love of God, where a heart for the world begins, I could argue that it's the home, So it's a massive responsibility and privilege.
Yeah, and it can have a multiplying effect,
Oh, yeah.
And I know you mentioned earlier that, at least to me, that you went on a number of short-term mission trips with your kids, and you
teenagers.
Yeah, what were those experiences like for you and your family?
Well, my daughter was in youth ministry, so she was young, and so she had fundraised, and so we flew from Virginia. We flew about 30 kids from Virginia down to Tampa, and we worked in the migrant children's camp. Just doing. So that was interesting because I was always on the other side. I was always driving the vans. We would sit around at night and play guitar and sing with the kids. And so for me, I was always part of that ministry piece, but also the process of what it takes to get that many children to be responsible for that many children.
Yeah.
When the parents are left behind, how many adults is it going to take? And just everything, just the daily schedules and hanging out at the airport. And
were those some meaningful just experiences for you to share with your daughter and doing
I just felt like we had a very good home church. It was really strong in missions, but I just feel that kind of bonds your family together. We have a lot of really good memories of where she was not old enough to rent a van, where she would just say, "My mom will do it."
Yeah.
But I always enjoyed it. So I mean, driving a van maybe 13 or 14 hours to Kentucky to go to a music festival for Ichthus.
Yeah.
And saying, "Oh, we got a great camping spot, Mom," and it would be right across from the Job Johnnies. But I mean, but so I have a lot of good memories like that. But I think those are the things that I think that they bond your families together. But I also think for those children who don't have that, it's good for them to see that, because sometimes in families and even in churches alone, you don't realize that not everyone that comes through the door has that kind of home life or experience, and for them to be there, that's their place of rest. So you get to mentor a lot of different children in that way, and you get to say, this is what a faith lives out. This is what it looks like to live out your faith,
right?
In that sense, and to have a good, strong mother-daughter relationship, and those kinds of things, and to be able to talk to your mom if you need to. In that way, it was a lot of sharing, and it's just a lot of bonding, and it does create a bond when you're both trying to accomplish a goal together.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool. In that case, you were ministering to your own children and to others. And I just think it's really cool when I hear of stories of people who maybe go to the mission field to specifically focus on maybe teaching in an international school, or maybe there isn't an international school and they want to really focus on education for kids that are a part of that team. I just think it's a really valuable contribution to team life, and in your case, you were helping to facilitate these trips, and you never know how a short-term trip might affect someone's life.
Every time I hear about one of those kids that have gone into ministry, it makes my heart glad.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that's awesome. Either they've gone into Christian music, or they've done, or they're leading their own youth group. It just makes my heart happy. I'm really glad.
Yeah.
That they have been bonded in that way, and that they came to know Christ, and that they are working through that.
Yeah.
So,
recently I was talking with someone who was coming through Pioneers for an event we had, and she was unsure a while ago. This was sort of her story. She was unsure of how God was going to use her, because she had just about finished a degree in marine biology. And it was not a cheap degree. It was not an easy degree to get. And then near the end, she realized, I think I'm called to do missions. She talked to her parents about it, and they were like, I don't know about that. And so she worked in marine biology, and then through a roundabout way ended up getting connected with somebody at Pioneers. And the long story short is she's now getting to go and use her marine biology background working on a sea cucumber farm in Southeast Asia, which is really cool. And I love that story, but I wanted to just maybe end this discussion giving each of you an opportunity to share maybe just like one word of encouragement to someone who is thinking about, I don't really know if this thing that I'm passionate about, whatever it is, maybe it's the arts, or maybe it's education, or maybe it's just being a mom, not just a mom. That's such a huge thing, but a mom, or doing project management, or media ministry, or just media, whatever it is, what word of encouragement would you give to them if they're thinking about, could this be used in missions in some way? I'm just curious if each of you could just share one thought.
I have a good quote that I read the other day.
Oh, sure.
Let's see if I can remember it. By Frederick Buechner, that says, "The place where God calls us is the place where our deepest pleasure meets with the world's deepest need." And I felt like that was such a great quote for summing up what missions is really, because it's like there's this aspect of what brings you joy, like the marine biology. What do you love? What are you attracted to? Where do you feel the pleasure of God most, and then combining that with a need that you see, or wanting to share the gospel, and how those two worlds can mesh. So I would just say, think about that quote. But it's possible that I think that as Christians, we can also be really interesting people, and that attracts people to God. So using what you love. But often, too, I think God does call us out of our comfort zone, and maybe calls us just to obey, maybe when we don't necessarily feel like we're in the most pleasurable thing that we're wanting to do. So I think it's both, you know.
It's both.
But
yeah, I mean, maybe just to sum up your point there too, is but like if you even have an inkling of something you feel like God could use in your life, just talk with someone about it too. Reach out and talk with someone about it, because I think there are, even hearing your story, there are ways God can connect you sort of that you wouldn't have imagined to the work that He's doing. But, Tom, what would you say to somebody who's considering?
Just be available. Availability is key, and if we're available, then our gifts can be leveraged in all kinds of different contexts, our particular unique capabilities. One of the most fruitful couples that I ever witnessed on the mission field was a couple living in the city we lived in for 17 years. And he came from Australia to work with an engineering firm to work in the city. And his wife was a physician, and she was working in an international clinic in the city. But they visited, just on a weekend trip, they visited an orphanage. And their hearts were broken by the needs that they saw. And then over the course of years, they ended up developing their own orphanage system with hundreds and hundreds of kids that were provided life-giving surgeries. They saved many lives. Hundreds of kids were adopted. It was an astonishing George Mueller-esque kind of a ministry. And they never went to, they never moved there remotely with the idea of doing something like that. It was just being on the scene with their particular respective gifts and his capability of building facilities and administrating large projects, and her medical gifting that was leveraged into this great work that they did. So availability is really a foundation.
That's so cool. Great story.
I think that for me, I would say be open, be listening, and follow your gut, which is usually the Holy Spirit. Because, but you also have to get, open and listening to feel the Holy Spirit working in your heart. I know that I had a lot of amazing conversations, spiritual conversations that were totally provided by the Lord, and I slowly got, I feel like we've all felt this, where it's just like, I feel like I could say this. Should I say this? And for a long time, I kind of ignored that because I was just like, oh, I don't want to make them feel uncomfortable. Oh, I don't want this to take a turn or for them to think I'm blah, 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 whatever. But I think it's really just important to get familiar with that feeling and also follow through with it, because it creates probably the most valuable conversations that you'll ever have. So those are my 3 things. Just be open, be listening, follow the Holy Spirit working in your belly.
Amazing.
I think as people, we all have so many different layers to us. We don't just have one thing in our personality or one thing that we're interested in. And especially, I think, as we live, we develop more and more interest. So my thing is that whatever we do and whatever that interest is that we can use that because I think it's staying connected. It's staying connected with God. It's making that connection and having that connection, that Holy Spirit in you, so that people can see that there is something different about you, that they want to not always ask, but they can ask, what is it that's so different about you? And I think using those layers in different areas of your life opens the door for that. It opens the door for people to be able to approach you. So, I think having a number of interests makes you a full person, but having that Holy Spirit and having those just, being open and acknowledging people and how important they are and how you think that they are important and that their salvation is important to you. I think you can use that in whatever your talents are.
Totally. Yeah. So awesome. Thanks, all of you. I do mean it. Thank you for taking the time to be here and talk about these things. I just value the diverse just contributions and backgrounds, and hopefully we can have you again sometime and talk. So if you enjoyed this discussion, I would ask that you subscribe, like our channel. Also, if you have other topics you think would be interesting for us to talk about, leave those in the comments below. And maybe as a final word, if you are considering missions and if you feel like there is a passion that you have or a skill that you have and you're unsure about whether or not God could use that for the Great Commission to reach people who don't have access to the gospel, we want to walk through that process with you. So just reach out to us. You can go to pioneers.org, or if you're ready to talk with someone, just send an email to go@pioneers.org. We'd really, really love to talk with you. So thanks for tuning in. Can we turn on the AC now?